"Happy birthday," my mother said without looking at me. I forced a smile. "Thanks, Mom." My father sat at the head of the table, tapping his fingers. "Sit down. We need to talk." Ethan leaned back in his chair, smirking. Lily stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. I swallowed. "What's going on?" Father said. "You're 25 now. Still broke. Still useless." I said, "I work every day." "I try." He cut me off. "Trying is for losers." Ethan laughed. "He's right. You've been dragging the family name down." I looked at Lily. "You don't think so, right?" She avoided my eyes. "I think you should be realistic." My chest tightened. "Realistic about what?" Father slid a folder across the table. "You're fired from the company." I stared. "What?" Ethan said, "I'm taking your position." I jumped to my feet. "You promised that job to me." Father said, "You didn't earn it." I turned to Lily. "Tell them this is wrong." She finally looked at me. "I'm leaving you." The room went silent. I whispered, "What did you say?" She said, "I can't stay with a man who has no future." Ethan wrapped an arm around her waist. "She's with me now." My ears rang. "You're joking," Lily said. "I'm serious. I deserve better." I laughed weakly. "After 5 years together?" She shrugged. "Love doesn't pay bills." My father stood. "Pack your things and leave." I said, "You're kicking me out?" Mother finally spoke. "Maybe this will teach you responsibility." I looked at her. "You're okay with this?" She whispered, "It's for your own good." I grabbed my suitcase. "You'll regret this." Ethan smiled. "It won't be missed." I walked out. Without looking back, outside rain soaked my clothes. I muttered, "Happy birthday to me." At the bar, I slammed my glass down. "Another?" the bartender asked. "Rough night?" I said, "My family buried me alive." He poured another drink. "2 new beginnings." I laughed. "2 endings." I stumbled onto the bridge, staring. At the dark water, I whispered, "Maybe they're right." My phone buzzed. A message from Lily. "Take care of yourself." I threw the phone. I said, "I gave you everything." The wind howled. I closed my eyes. I don't deserve to live. Headlights flashed, a horn blared, then nothing. I woke up gasping. "Wake up. You'll be late." I froze. That voice, "Mom?" She stood in the doorway. "Don't say my name like that." I sat up. "Where am I?" She frowned. "In your room." I looked around my childhood posters, my old desk, my cracked mirror I grabbed. My phone, the date stared back at me 5 years ago, I whispered. "This can't be real." Mom said, "Get dressed. Your interview is today." My heart pounded. "What interview?" she said. "The Hayes Corporation trainee program." I shook. "Dad promised that to Ethan." She snapped, "Hurry up," ran downstairs. Father sat. Reading the paper, Ethan tied his tie. Lily stood near the door. "Alive, smiling," I whispered. "I'm dreaming." Ethan said, "What are you staring at?" I said, "Nothing." Father said, "Don't mess this up." I nodded. "I won't." Lily stepped closer. "Good luck." Her eyes were gentle. My chest burned. I whispered, "Thank you." Ethan scoffed. "Like you need luck." In the car, he said, "You'll never get in." I said, "We'll see." He laughed. "You're delusional." At the office lobby, he said, "Don't embarrass us." I said, "Don't worry." The receptionist smiled. Next, Ethan pushed past me. "That's me," she said. "Both of you." Inside the room, the interviewer said, "Why should we hire you?" Ethan said, "Because I'm better than him." I said, "Because I won't waste your time." The man raised an eyebrow. Ethan sneered. "He's broke," I said, "but I'm hungry." The interviewer nodded. "We'll call." Outside, Ethan said, "You failed?" I said, "I didn't." He said, "Dreamer." At home, Father asked, "How did it go?" Ethan said. He froze. I said, "I did fine." Father said, "We'll see." That night, Lily called. "Can we talk?" She asked. I said, "Sure." She Said, I want us to be serious. I swallowed. I do too, she said, then prove you can succeed. I said, I will. She said, I hope so. Stared at the ceiling. I whispered, this is my second chance. My phone buzzed. An email. Congratulations. You have been selected. I laughed. I cried. I said, this time, I win. The past couldn't hurt me anymore. The future was mine, and I would never beg again. I woke up shaking. I stared at my hands. There, young again. Mark sat on my bed. You talking to yourself again? I said, Mark, what year is it? He blinked. You hit your head. I grabbed my phone. Answer me. He sighed. It's 2019. Why? My chest tightened. I'm alive. He laughed. You always were dramatic, I whispered. Not like this, Mark said. You look like you saw a ghost, I said. I saw my future. He frowned. That bad? I nodded. Worse. He leaned forward. Talk to me. I said, Ethan will steal my job. Mark said, your brother's a snake. I said, Lily will leave me. Mark said, she already treats you cold. I said, my father will throw me out. And Mark muttered, man, that family never deserved you. I stood up. I'm changing. Everything. Mark raised a brow. How? I said. I move first. My phone buzzed. A message from Lily. We need to talk. I showed Mark. Here it comes, he said. Let me guess. Money problems, I replied. Meet me tonight. Mark said, you. Sure? I said, I need closure. At the cafe, Lily stirred her drink. She smiled. You look tired, I said. Say it. She blinked. Say what? I said, you're leaving me. Her hand froze. I said, you want security. Whispered, I want stability, I said. Ethan promised you that. Her eyes widened. How do you know? Stood. We're done. She grabbed my wrist. Wait. I pulled away. Don't call me again, she said. You'll regret this. I said, no, you will. Outside, I breathed deep. Mark called. How'd it go? Said, clean break, said, proud. Of you, I said. I quit begging. He laughed. That's new. The next morning, Father called me into his office. He said, you embarrassed me. I said, by existing. He said, by failing. Said, I won't anymore. Scoffed. Dreams don't feed families, I said. Then watch me eat. He slammed his pen. Get out. I nodded gladly. Ethan smirked outside. He said, Dad finally kicked you out. I said, I quit. He laughed. Same result? I said, you're about to lose. He leaned close. You always lose. Smiled. Watch me. At lunch, Mark said, you just burned bridges. I said, I built better roads. He said, where to? I said, Daniel Brooks. Mark whistled. The legend. I nodded. He's hiring. Mark said, he never hires nobodies. Said he will. At the office tower, the guard stopped me. He said, do you have an appointment? I said, tell Mr. Brooks I know the North Harbor deal. The guard frowned. At here. Mark whispered, you're insane. I said, trust me. A tall man approached. He said, you asked for me. I said, Daniel Brooks. He studied me. You're young. I said, but I'm right. He crossed his arms. About what? Said, North Harbor collapses in 6 months. He narrowed his eyes. Explain. I said, bad loans. It's fake assets. Hidden debt. He paused. Who told you? I said, your future. Mark coughed. He means research. Daniel smiled slightly. Come inside. In his office, Daniel said, why should I trust you? I said, because I'll make you richer. He laughed. Honest answer. I said, I want a chance. He said, what do you want? I said, a job. He said, you're bold. I said, I'm desperate. Good combination. He slid a contract. 6-month trial. I picked it up. I won't disappoint. Right. He said, everyone says that. I said, I'm not everyone. Outside, Mark hugged me. He said, you did it. I said, first step, he said, drinks tonight. I said, celebration later. That evening, Ethan called. He said, heard you join Brooks. I said, word travels. Fast. He laughed. You'll burn out. I said, you'll watch me rise. He said, you're delusional. I said, you're scared. He hung up. At home, Mother asked, why did you leave your father's company? I said, because I chose myself. She whispered, you're making a mistake, I said. So did you? She turned away. I sat on my bed. I whispered, no more begging. Mark texted, proud of you. I replied, just starting. The next week's blurred. Daniel tested me. He said, analyze this. I said, it's a trap. He said, why? I said, look at the margins. He nodded. Good eye. He said, run. Projections, I said, they're lying. He smiled. You're sharp. Mark said, you're glowing. I said, I'm hungry. One night, Daniel said, you remind me of me. I said, did you start poor? Way, he said, I started angry. I said, me too. He said, anger builds empires. I said, then teach me. He said, I will. At dinner, Ethan mocked me. He said, still chasing dreams? I said, still stealing futures? He sneered. You think you're special? I said, No, I am. He slammed the table. You're nothing. I stood. I was weak. He laughed. Still are. I leaned close. Not anymore. Silence fell. I walked away. In the mirror, I met my eyes. I said, never again. My phone buzzed. An email from Brooks. Promotion approved. I laughed. I said, this is my turning point. Mark called. Boss man now. I said, just getting started. He said, they'll regret doubting you. I said, they already should. I lay back and breathed. I whispered, I write my fate. Mark leaned back in his chair and said, you ever notice how quiet success is? I smiled. It only gets loud when people lose, he said. Your office is bigger than my apartment now, I said. You said I was crazy. He laughed. I said you were dangerous. I looked out the window. They're watching. Mark said, your family? I nodded. They can smell the fall. My phone buzzed. Mark said, speak of the devil. I read the message. Ethan wants a meeting. Mark said, tell him to beg. I typed busy building empires. Mark grinned. Cold, I said. Accurate. Daniel walked in. Quarterly report. I said, read me the highlights. He said, we passed North Harbor. I said, I told you they'd bleed. He nodded. You were right. Mark said he's always right. Daniel said, your brother isn't. I raised an eyebrow. You tracking him? Daniel said his company is drowning, said. He laughed when I drowned. Daniel said he's not laughing now. Mark said karma clocks in on time. My phone rang. Ethan, I answered. Speak. He said, we need to talk. I said, about what? He said, a partnership. I laughed. You mean a rescue? He snapped. Don't get smart, I said. Too late. He said, you think you're better than me? I said, I am. He hung up. Mark whistled. That was brutal. I said, that was polite. Daniel said, be careful. I said, I am. At lunch, Lily texted, we should meet, I showed Mark. He said, she smells money. I replied, wrong number, Mark said, savage. Said she chose her future. That night, news exploded. Stocks crashed, banks froze, companies burned. Mark called. Me, have you seen the market? I said, I predicted it. He said, your family's stock dropped 40%. I said, that's just the beginning. He said, Ethan's company is finished. I said, good. At midnight, my phone rang. Unknown number, I answered. Hello? A broken voice said, it's me. I said, who? He whispered, Ethan. I leaned back. You sound scared, he said. Everything's gone. He said, you should. Smile, he said, please help me. I said, why? He said, we're brothers. I laughed. You fired me, he said. I was wrong. You stole my life. He said, I'll do anything. I said, I don't have a brother. He said, please. I hung up. Mark texted, did he beg? I replied, he cried. Mark sent a laughing emoji. The next morning, Daniel said, your father is downstairs. I paused. My father. Daniel nodded. Security called. I said, "Let him wait," Mark said. "That's cold," I said. "He taught me." An hour later, I went down. He stood near the door. His suit was wrinkled. His hair was gray. He said, "You look well." I said, "You look desperate." He swallowed. "We need to talk." I said, "We finished talking years ago." He said, "I made mistakes." I said, "You buried me." He said, "I was wrong." Crossed my arms. "Now you know." He said, "The company is failing." I said, "I know." He said, "We need you." I said, "You kicked me out." He said, "I was angry." I said, "So was I." He said, "You're my son." I said, "You disowned me." He whispered, "I regret it." I looked at the sky. "Karma works fast," he said. "Please." I said, "This building is mine." I said, "I know." I said, "That chair upstairs is mine." He nodded. "I know." I said, "And you're standing outside like a stranger." He said, "Let me in." I said, "Why?" He said, "I have nothing." I said, "I had nothing." He said, "I need you." I said, "You needed me before." He bowed his head. I was blind. I said, "Now you see." He said, "Can we talk inside?" I said, "You can walk away." He said, "I won't." I opened the door. Inside, Mark whispered, "Is that him?" Said, "The man who raised me." Mark said, "He looks broken." Said, "So was I." In the office, Father. "Sat," he said, "You built all this?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Without us?" I said, "Because of you." He sighed. "Your brother lost everything," I said. "He earned it." He said, "Lily left him." I said, "She follows money." He said, "I lost my company." I said, "You gambled." He said, "I trusted the wrong people." I said, "You trusted Ethan." He flinched. He said, "I was wrong." I said, "You always were." He said, "Help me save it." I said, "Save what?" He said, "Our name." I said, "You ruined it." He said, "You can fix it." I leaned forward. "Why should I?" He said, "Because you're better." I said, "I had to become better." He said, "I'm proud of you." I laughed. "Too late," Mark said. "Boss, meeting in 10. I said, "Give us a minute." Father said, "You won." I said, "I survived." He said, "What do you want?" I said, "Respect." He said, "You have it." I said, "From everyone but you." He said, "You have it now." I said, "I earned it." He nodded. "You did." I stood. "We're done." We said, "You won't help?" I said. "I'll watch." He stood slowly. "I understand," I said. "Do you?" He said, "I lost my son." I said, "You threw him away." He left. Mark said, "That was heavy." I said, "That was closure." Daniel said, "You okay?" I said, "I'm free." Mark said, "They're finished." I said, "They chose it." That night, Ethan texted, "I'm sorry. I blocked him." Lily sent a message. "I miss ya." I deleted it. I stood on my balcony. The city glowed. I whispered, "This is my world now." Mark said, "Still thinking?" I said, "Still winning." He said, "They'll never recover." I said, "Neither did I." Raised a glass to revenge. I shook my head. "To justice." He smiled. "Same thing." I laughed. "Not anymore." I looked at the sky. I said, "Success tastes better when enemies watch." I was just getting started. My father sat across from me with his hands shaking. He said, "You're our only hope." I leaned back. 5 years ago, you said I was nothing." He swallowed. I was wrong. Mark stood near the window. Daniel stood beside me. I said, "You threw me into the street," Father said. I was angry. I said, "You were cruel." He nodded. "I deserve this." I slid the contract across the table. I said, "Read it." He picked it up with trembling fingers. He said, "You own the company now." I said, "You signed it." He said, "I had no choice." Said, "I didn't either." He whispered, "Please save it." Asked, "Save what?" He said, "Our family name." I said, "You destroyed it." He said, "You can rebuild it." I looked at Ethan sitting in the corner. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I said, "You lost everything." Ethan said, "I lost you first." Said, "You chose power over blood," he whispered. I was blind. I said, "Now you see." Lily's name sat between us like a ghost. I said, "Where is she?" Ethan said, "She disappeared." I said, "When the money left?" He nodded, Father said. We made mistakes. I said, you made choices. Mark said, boss, the board is waiting. I said, they can wait. Daniel said, take your time. I looked at my father. I said, you once told me I would die poor. He whispered, I was wrong. I said, you said I was useless. I said, I regret it. I said, you disowned me. He said, I was proud. I said, you were heartless. He closed his eyes. I stood. I said, stand up. He slowly rose. I said, look at me. He met my eyes. I said, I am not your son anymore. He flinched. I said, I am your boss. Silence filled the room. Mark let out a breath. Daniel nodded once. Ethan stared at the floor. Father whispered, I accept. I said, then listen. He said, I'm listening. I said, I will save the company. He nodded. I said, you will step down. He nodded again. I said, Ethan is out. Ethan looked up. What? I said, you're fired. He said, you can't do that. I said, I own everything. He said, I'm your brother. I said, you sold me. He said, I was. Afraid, I said, so was I. He whispered, please. I said, leave. Mark opened the door. Ethan stood slowly. He said, I was wrong. I said, you were greedy. He said, I lost everything. I said, now you know how it feels. He walked out. The door closed behind him. Father said, you're cruel. I said, I learned from you. He nodded. I said, the board will answer to me. He said, yes. I said, your salary is gone. I said, I don't care. I said, your title is gone. He said, I understand. I said, your power is gone. He whispered, I deserve it. I sat back down. I said, sin. The contract. He picked up the pen. His hand shook harder. He said, I never thought this day would come. I said, I dreamed of it. He signed. The pen clicked. I took the contract. I said, it's done. Father slumped into the chair. He said, what happens now? I said, you watch. He said, will you forgive me? I paused. I said, I will move forward. He nodded. Mark said, boss, the board is ready. I stood. I said, let's go. Father said, you're powerful now. I said, I had to become. Daniel said, you earned it. I walked to the door. Father said, son. I stopped. He said, I'm proud of you. I turned. I said, I don't need your pride. He closed his eyes. I walked out. The boardroom was full. They all stood when I entered. I said, sit. It. Sat. I said, this company survives today. Man asked, under what terms? I said, under my control. A woman said, and the old leadership? I said, gone. Another asked, your vision? I said, profit with discipline. They nodded. I said, loyalty with results. They nodded again. I said, betrayal ends here. Silence followed. I said, any objections? No one spoke. I said, meeting adjourned. They stood. Mark grinned. He said, you did it? I said, we did. Daniel said, you chose justice. I said, I chose control. We walked back to my office. The city shined below. Mark said, they need you now. I said, they always did. Daniel said, you broke the chain. I said, I built my own. Mark said, what about Ethan? I said, he'll survive. Mark said, and Lily? I said, she chose her path. Daniel said, you chose yours. I sat at my desk. I said, sometimes losing everything is how you gain destiny. Mark said, you sound like a legend. Said, I started as a failure. Daniel said, you finished as a king. I smiled. I said, they threw me away. Mark said, now they bow. Said, I don't need revenge. Daniel said, you became justice. I looked at the skyline. I whispered, I finally won.